Welcome to the channel. Here, we dive deep into powerful books and break down their ideas in a calm, thoughtful way. In today's episode, we explore The Creation of Patriarchy, Women and History by Gerda Lerner, a profound examination of how patriarchal systems emerged, evolved, and shaped the roles and experiences of women across history. If you enjoy clear, thoughtful breakdowns like this, make sure to subscribe and stay with us for more.
Imagine, if you can, the exact moment human beings realized that people could actually be used as currency.
Oh, yeah. That's a huge thought.
Right. I mean, try to picture it. It doesn't start in some, corporate boardroom or a bank.
Yeah.
It literally starts with the invention of the plow.
Yeah, in the mud.
Exactly.
Yeah.
In the rut of the ancient Near East. This is thousands of years before the first coin was ever even minted. It's when human communities looked at these newly cultivated fields around them and realized that the key to unimaginable wealth wasn't just the land itself.
Right.
It was the bodies required to work that land.
And that realization, that sets off this massive chain reaction that just completely rewrites the human operating system, essentially.
Yeah.
We're talking about a shift that is so profound that it permanently altered how we define power, how we define property, and ultimately how we define what it means to be male or female.
Welcome to the intensely curious mind listening right now. We know exactly why you are here. You want to understand the deep structural currents of our world, right? Mm-hmm. You're looking for those multiple perspectives, the actual root causes of why things are the way they are. And crucially, you want to get there without drowning in just, dry academic jargon.
Nobody wants that.
No, definitely not. So today's deep dive is monumental. We are setting out to explore a historical landscape that is notoriously difficult to navigate. Because, usually when we talk about archaeology, there's this comforting precision to it.
Sure, yeah. You dig into the earth, you find a shattered clay pot or something.
Right, and carbon dating gives you a century, and the archaeologist just points and says, there it is, that's how they stored their grain.
It's totally tangible. But when you step into the world of social archaeology, which is what we're doing today, when you try to actually dig up the origins of human relationships, of power dynamics, or, the very concept of gender, that physical trowel becomes essentially useless.
You can't exactly carbon date a social construct, right?
Exactly. You have to reconstruct the whole architecture of human thought from these fragments of laws and myths and economic records. It's detective work on a massive scale.
Which brings us to our source material for today. We have this massive stack of excerpts, notes, and analyses, and it's all drawn from the landmark 1986 text, The Creation of Patriarchy by the historian Gerda Lerner.
Such an incredibly ambitious project, really.
It is. Lerner investigates the origins of male dominance, specifically focusing on the ancient Near East, so the cradle of Western civilization between roughly 3100 BC and 600 BC.
And that specific 2,500-year window is just crucial because it perfectly bridges the gap between prehistory and recorded history.
Right.
It's the exact period where human beings first started writing things down, building cities, and creating what we would now call the state.
So our mission today, for you listening, is to completely reframe how we look at that history. We are going to explore this profound and honestly paradigm-shattering idea that patriarchy is not some natural biological inevitability.
Right, it's not.
It's not hardwired into human DNA. It is a man-made historical construct.
Yeah.
It took over 2.5 millennia to build, layer by layer, law by law, myth by myth.
Yeah.
And the underlying logic of that realization is actually incredibly empowering.
Yeah.
Because if a system has a historical beginning, it can have a historical end.
Absolutely. But before we wade any deeper into these waters, we really need to establish a very clear ground rule for our discussion today.
Yes, definitely.
So you, the listener, should know that the sources we're working with touch on some highly sensitive, really heavily charged topics, because Lerner builds her historical analysis using various theoretical frameworks.
Right. She pulls from a lot of different areas.
She does. She engages deeply with interpretations of Marxist theory. So like Friedrich Engels' work on the origins of the family and private property. And she also conducts these highly analytical, critical interpretations of sacred texts, specifically looking at the Book of Genesis and the development of Judeo-Christian theology.
Yeah.
And I just want to be entirely clear here. We are not endorsing these viewpoints. We are not taking political sides, and we are absolutely not making religious judgments.
Not at all.
Our goal is strictly and impartially exploring the historical and theoretical arguments exactly as they are presented in Lerner's text. We're just examining how these ideas and texts functioned as historical forces that, shaped early civilization.
Right. We are here to look at the mechanics of history, pure and simple.
Yeah.
So ask yourself, if this system wasn't always here, well, what did the world look like before it was built?
That's the million-dollar question.
Because to understand how radical Lerner's thesis actually is, we first have to dismantle what we can call the traditionalist view of gender.
Right.
Because for centuries, the dominant narratives, and I mean this was fully accepted by mainstream science and history, was that male dominance is universal and natural.
Yeah, the whole biology is destiny argument. For a very, very long time, anthropologists and historians basically looked at the modern world, saw that men held the vast majority of political and economic power, and just retroactively assumed, well, it must have always been that way due to evolutionary hardwiring.
It's like, look at the present to explain the past.
Yeah,
right?
Exactly. And the logic was heavily based on physical dimorphism. Yeah. Men, generally having greater upper body strength, naturally took on the roles of hunters and warriors.
Right.
So they became the providers of food and the defenders of the tribe.
While women who were, constrained by the biological realities of constant pregnancy and childbirth and nursing, they were naturally relegated to the domestic sphere as nurturers.
Yeah.
The traditionalist view basically argues that this physical difference necessitated a strict sexual division of labor, which inevitably evolved into male supremacy. Mm-hmm. The man, the hunter, protects the woman, the nurturer. It sounds very, neat and tidy.
It does. And honestly, its neatness is exactly why it remained unquestioned for so long. It is a very comfortable narrative because it totally absolves society of any responsibility for inequality.
Because it's just nature.
Right. It essentially claims that nobody is to blame for power imbalances. It's literally just nature taking its course. But modern anthropology and feminist historians have completely upended this narrative by pointing out a really crucial foundational distinction, and that is biology determines sex, but culture determines gender.
Let's expand on that a bit for the listener. So biology gives us the physical hardware, chromosomes, reproductive organs, hormones, but culture writes the software. Culture dictates what those biological differences actually mean in terms of power or behavior or social value.
Exactly. And when anthropologists actually began studying the earliest human social formation, so hunting and gathering societies, they did not find the strict oppressive hierarchies that the traditionalist model had predicted.
They didn't.
No, not at all. Instead of male dominance, they found complementarity.
Okay, what does that look like in practice?
Well, there absolutely was a division of labor. That part is true. Men generally focused on hunting large game, and women generally focused on gathering plant foods, trapping small animals, and managing the camp.
Right.
But the economic reality of that division was a total revelation.
Because the hunting wasn't actually the primary source of calories.
Far from it. In most hunter-gatherer societies, the gathering, which was done by women, provided upwards of 70 to 80% of the daily caloric intake.
Wait, 80%?
Yeah. Because hunting is an incredibly high-risk, high-reward activity, a hunting party might go out and come back totally empty-handed for days at a time.
Oh, right. You don't always catch the mammoth.
Exactly. So the gathering, the reliable, everyday acquisition of roots, nuts, fruits, and small game, that was the baseline sustenance that literally kept the entire tribe from starving to death when the hunt failed.
Which means their economic contribution wasn't just some supplementary side project. It was the absolute core of the tribe's survival.
Yes. And because their economic contribution was so vital, women in these early societies held significant social and decision-making power. It was a true system of mutual interdependence.
That makes a lot of sense.
The concept of one group dominating the other simply didn't make any sense in an environment where survival required total, balanced cooperation. I mean, you don't disenfranchise the people who provide 80% of your food.
You'd be shooting yourself in the foot.
Literally.
So we have this baseline of human existence which lasts for tens of thousands of years, by the way, characterized by relatively egalitarian mutual interdependence. So what broke the balance? I mean, when did the cultural software actually get rewritten?
The shift really begins with what is probably the most significant economic transition in human history, which is the Neolithic agricultural revolution, the advent of sedentarism.
So moving from a nomadic lifestyle to basically settling down and farming the land. Which starts happening, what, roughly 10,000 to 12,000 years ago in the Fertile Crescent?
Right around then, yeah. And when human beings stop moving and start cultivating grain, the entire economic and social model of existence is just turned completely upside down.
Okay.
Let's look at the basic mathematics of survival here. In a nomadic hunter-gatherer society, having too many children is an active liability.
Because you have to carry them.
Yes, you have to physically carry infants and toddlers from camp to camp. Spacing out births is literally a matter of life and death.
But in an agricultural society, the rules of the game completely flip, don't they?
Drastically.
Yeah.
Once you settle on a piece of land, children transition from being a nomadic burden to being the absolute most valuable form of labor.
Because farming is incredibly hard work.
It's backbreaking. It requires an immense amount of physical labor, clearing land, planting, weeding, harvesting, processing the grain. The more children a family or a tribe has, the more hands they have to work the fields.
Right.
And more hands mean you can cultivate more land, which produces a surplus of food. And surplus food, fundamentally, is the very first form of accumulated wealth.
So suddenly, the biological capacity to produce children becomes the most valuable economic engine a society possesses.
Yes. And this creates a really profound shift in how early tribes interacted with one another. To understand this, Lerner draws really heavily on the work of the structural anthropologist Claude Lévi-Strauss.
Okay, what was his theory?
She specifically looks at his theory regarding the exchange of women. So in these early nascent agricultural societies, groups were beginning to bump up against each other, right? They're competing for prime arable land and water sources.
Because everyone's settled down now.
Exactly. And this competition easily led to debilitating constant warfare. So to avoid mutual annihilation, these tribes really needed to cement alliances. And they did this through marriage. But it was specifically women who were exchanged.
Okay, let me stop you right there.
Why?
Why specifically women? I mean, why wasn't it an equal exchange of sons and daughters to make peace?
It entirely comes down to the biological bottleneck of reproduction. If a tribe wants to rapidly expand its population to, increase its labor force and its wealth, the limiting factor is female reproductive capacity.
Because one man can father children with multiple women.
Right. But a woman can only endure so many pregnancies in a given time frame. Therefore, a tribe with more women can produce more children. So women's reproductive capacity basically became a highly valued, commodified resource.
Wow.
Tribes began trading, negotiating for, and sometimes capturing women from rival groups to ensure peace alliances and to just increase their own demographic strength.
I am really struggling to conceptualize how this actually played out on the ground, though. Let's really look at the human element here for a second. You're describing a situation where half the population is essentially turned into a geopolitical bargaining chip. Mm-hmm. So imagine a sort of startup company, right? Mm-hmm. That's our early tribe. Everyone does different but equal jobs. Suddenly the market shifts. That's the agriculture part. One department, the men, realizes they can literally trade the members of the other department, the women, to rival companies for peace and profit.
That's a brutal analogy, but it's apt.
But how does that happen? If I'm a woman living in an early Neolithic village, working alongside the men, creating the food surplus, and the village elders suddenly announce, hey, we are trading you to the Valley tribe to secure water rights and prevent a war.
Yeah.
I'm not just packing my bags quietly.
No, of course not.
There has to be massive friction.
Yeah.
Exactly how did they convince the women to go along with this without an immediate revolt?
That is the essential question, isn't it? And answering it requires us to really step away from our modern understanding of individual rights. Because this transition did not happen in a single generation. And it wasn't some hostile takeover plotted by a cabal of men in a smoky room. It evolved glacially over centuries, and it grew directly out of that biological necessity and mutual interdependence we just discussed earlier.
Right.
In a prehistoric context, the survival of the group always supersedes the desires of the individual.
To collective over the self.
Always. I mean, if your village is facing the immediate threat of being wiped out by a warring neighbor, or facing starvation due to a lack of resources, and the elders, who, by the way, often included older women.
Oh, really?
Yes. If the elders determine that a marriage alliance is literally the only way to secure peace, the young women accepted those arrangements. They consented to this division of labor because at that exact moment in history, it served the survival of their family and their community.
Because the alternative was violence and death.
Exactly.
So they are making a completely rational choice for survival in the short term without realizing the massive long-term trap they were walking into.
They could not possibly foresee that centuries or millennia later, this practice of exogamy, which just means marrying outside the tribe, would institutionalize a system that completely disenfranchised them.
Yeah, how could they?
But if we pull back and look at the psychological shift this exchange created, the implications are just staggering, because once the practice of exchanging women became normalized, a fundamental cognitive divide occurred. Women were no longer seen entirely as equal, autonomous human beings.
They became something else.
They took on a dual status. They were humans, yes, but they were also instruments for the political and economic designs of men. Men became the exchangers, the actors, the decision makers, the protectors, and women became the exchange, the reified commodity, the pacifiers, the protected.
You became a resource, almost like land, or later, cattle.
And this leads to one of Lerner's absolute most critical assertions. She argues that the appropriation by men of women's sexual and reproductive capacity occurred prior to the formation of private property and class society.
Prior.
Yes. See, Engels had theorized that the invention of private property led to the subjugation of women. But Lerner completely flips this.
Okay, how so?
She demonstrates that the commodification of women was the very first form of property. It lies at the absolute foundation of the concept of private ownership itself. Before men ever learned to own land, they learned to own the reproductive labor of women.
Oh, wow. That reframes everything.
Yeah.
The very concept of ownership was essentially beta tested on human reproduction.
Exactly.
But, trading women for tribal alliances in scattered villages is just one stage of development. How do we get from a Neolithic village trading daughters for peace to the massive oppressive class systems of the ancient Near East? Because now we are talking about the leap to ancient empires.
Yeah.
Monumental architecture, standing armies, and widespread slavery.
Right, the big stuff. Well, that brings us to the rise of the archaic state. So as agriculture advanced and irrigation techniques improved, surpluses grew massive. And we start to see the rise of the first true cities in Mesopotamia, places like Uruk and Ur. Now, this huge concentration of wealth and population necessitated complex economies, administration, and eventually the archaic state itself.
And with the state comes deeply entrenched hierarchies and organized militarism.
Yes. Warfare scales up drastically. It's no longer just tribal skirmishes over a well. It's organized campaigns of conquest.
Right.
And with organized warfare comes the logistics of dealing with the conquered. This is exactly where we see the invention of formal slavery. And Lerner makes a really profound, highly specific point about the origin of this institution. She argues that the mass enslavement of women preceded the enslavement of men.
Wait. Why wouldn't a conquering army just enslave everyone? I mean, if labor is wealth, like we just established, why not take all the labor you can possibly get?
It comes down to the psychology and the physical reality of early mankind. Think about it. If your army conquers a rival city-state, the men of that city are trained warriors. They are deeply hostile, and they possess the physical strength to overpower their captors if they're given half a chance. At this very early stage of history, the conquering state simply did not have the psychological conditioning or the architectural infrastructure or the institutional mechanisms to safely keep a large population of hostile grown men in perpetual subjugation.
Because if you hand a conquered warrior a heavy agricultural tool,
He will absolutely use it to kill you in your sleep.
okay, yeah, that makes perfect sense. So historically, in these earliest conquests, what did they do?
The standard practice was simply to kill the men of the defeated group.
Just eliminate the immediate physical threat entirely. But what happens to the women?
The women, and often the children, were taken as captives. They were brought back to the conquering city and forcibly integrated into the society to perform sexual, reproductive, and domestic labor.
Okay.
And this dynamic right here represents the major psychological breakthrough of slavery. By enslaving women from outside groups, men learned how to institute total dominance over other human beings.
Because they had already laid the cultural groundwork for controlling women within their own society.
You've hit the nail on the head. Exactly. They had already spent millennia establishing a system where their own women were subordinate, exchanged in marriage and controlled by patriarchal heads of household.
Right, right.
So taking an outside woman, stripping her of her kin network, and treating her as total, absolute property was not an unimaginable cognitive leap. It was simply an extreme extension of existing patriarchal logic.
That is so dark.
It is. Lerner argues that it was quite literally upon the bodies of captive women that men practiced, refined, and perfected the techniques of enslavement. They learned how to psychologically break a human being, how to physically coerce labor, how to manage human property. And once they perfected those techniques on women, they eventually, centuries later, applied those exact same systems to conquered men and much later to lower class men from within their own societies.
The darkness of that progression is really hard to overstate. The mechanisms of human enslavement were literally forged by exploiting the vulnerabilities of captive women.
Yes.
And this completely shatters how we usually talk about social class, doesn't it? Because we usually define class entirely through economics.
We do. But Lerner points out that because of this specific historical trajectory, the very definition of class became fundamentally different for men and women.
Okay, how so?
Well, for men, from the ancient world all the way to the modern era, class is defined by their relationship to the means of production. It is defined by what property they own, their military might, their economic leverage, or their specialized skills.
Right.
But for women in the archaic state, class was mediated entirely through their sexual ties to a man.
Let me see if I can map this out and make sure I'm getting it. So for a man, climbing the social ladder involves acquiring land or wealth or getting a higher rank in the military. It's about his direct interaction with the world. But for a woman in the ancient world, her resume doesn't matter. Her currency is her sexual fidelity and the status of the man who basically claims ownership over her.
That is an incredibly sharp way to phrase it, yes. If you examine the social strata of the ancient Near East, you find a distinct spectrum of female unfreedom.
A spectrum of unfreedom.
Yeah. At the absolute bottom of this hierarchy was the slave woman. She was a captive or a debtor, completely commodified. She was sexually and economically exploited with literally no legal rights or protections whatsoever.
Right.
Then, moving slightly up the ladder, you had the slave concubine. Now, she was still legally property, but if her sexual and reproductive performance pleased her master specifically, if she bore him healthy sons.
Because it's all about labor and inheritance.
Exactly. If she did that, she could actually achieve a degree of upward mobility.
Upward mobility achieved purely through biological performance.
Yes. She might gain special privileges within the household, and her children might actually gain inheritance rights or even be legitimized by the father. And then, at the very top of this patriarchal ladder, you had the respectable wife. She was a free woman, she had legal rights under the law, she had property protections, and she enjoyed high social status.
But there's a catch.
There is a massive catch. This is the foundational caveat of patriarchy. All of those rights, privileges, and protections were entirely contingent upon her strictly controlled sexuality. Her absolute monogamous fidelity to her husband was the mandatory price of her class privilege.
So even the woman at the very top of the hierarchy, the wealthy wife of a nobleman, is still fundamentally defined by who she belongs to sexually.
Yes.
Her class isn't actually hers, it's an extension of his.
That is the absolute core of paternalistic dominance. And this raises an implication that I really think is crucial to sit with. Consider how deeply this history intertwines the roots of sexism and racism, or tribalism.
Well, that's interesting.
The very invention of slavery, this idea that one human can own another, required men to first dehumanize a group based on biological differences, which was sex. They had to conceptualize women as other and as property before they could ever conceptualize applying that same dehumanization to outsiders based on race, ethnicity, or tribal affiliation.
Wow. So the matrix of patriarchal relations was firmly laid down before economic and political developments fully institutionalized the state apparatus.
Precisely. A psychological infrastructure of oppression was built first.
Okay, but relying purely on psychological conditioning or brute physical force is exhausting. I mean, a society cannot survive for centuries just through men standing guard over captives with swords, or husbands constantly asserting physical dominance at home.
No, it's not sustainable.
Right. To maintain this complex new hierarchy, these varying classes of slaves, concubines, and controlled wives, the archaic state needed a much more efficient system of control. They basically had to write male dominance into the very DNA of civilization. They had to invent formal law.
And that is exactly what we witness in the archaeological record of Mesopotamia. We can vividly trace the formalization of patriarchy through the written law codes.
Like which ones?
Well, beginning with the Code of Hammurabi around 1750 BC, and then moving down through history to the Middle Assyrian Law around 1250 BC. And what we see over this roughly 500-year span is a monumental shift.
What happens?
patriarchal dominance moves from being a private, informal practice enforced by individual fathers to becoming a public, codified law enforced by the full punitive power of the state.
So the government essentially steps in to manage the household.
Yeah.
But why? Why does the state care so much about what happens inside a single family's home?
Because the architects of the archaic state recognized a really fundamental truth about power. The state's overall authority depended entirely on the stability of the patriarchal family. The patriarchal family wasn't just a part of the state, it was the basic cell, the fundamental building block of the entire social order.
Oh, I see. It's a fractal structure. The micro reflects the macro.
Exactly the right concept. Let's look at the Code of Hammurabi as an example. The laws grant fathers and husbands absolute, unquestioned authority over their households. A man could divorce his wife relatively easily. But if a wife was caught in adultery, the law dictated she be bound and thrown into the river to drown.
Drowned in the river. That is so extreme.
It is, but the state mandated this severe punishment not out of some abstract moral outrage, but to absolutely guarantee paternity.
Ah, because of the inheritance.
Yes. Guaranteeing paternity ensures that property and wealth are passed down the legitimate male line, which prevents massive economic chaos. And beyond that, by training children and wives to submit absolutely to the patriarchal head of the household, the state was simultaneously training its entire population to be submissive citizens to an absolutist king.
That is brilliant and terrifying.
The state had a massive vested interest in ensuring men controlled their women because that micro-level control maintained the macro-level political order.
And nothing really illustrates the state's obsession with regulating female behavior better than the laws regarding the veil. I mean, this specific historical detail completely shifted my perspective when I read it.
It usually does.
Walk us through Middle Assyrian Law, Section 40.
So, Middle Assyrian law, often referred to as ML Section 40, is one of the most revealing pieces of historical legislation we possess. Enacted around 1250 BC, this law legally divided all women in the Assyrian Empire into two distinct, uncompromising categories, based entirely on their sexual ties to men.
Okay.
On one side, you had respectable women. This included wives, widows, and the unmarried daughters of free men. The law strictly dictated that these women must be veiled whenever they stepped out into public spaces.
Must be veiled. So the veil actually originated as a legal requirement for the upper class.
Yes, exactly. But on the other side of this divide, you had not respectable women, harlots, prostitutes, and slaves. The law violently forbidden these women from wearing a veil.
We really need to pause here because this completely contradicts the modern narrative. I mean, we almost exclusively hear the veil discussed today in terms of religious modesty or hiding female beauty.
Right, but in its origin, it had absolutely nothing to do with religious modesty. What is so fascinating about Mel Section 40 is that the state assumed total visual control of female sexuality through a piece of fabric.
Yeah.
The veil was an overt marker of ownership and class. A veiled woman walking through the market was signaling to the world, I belong to a powerful man, I am under his protection, I am respectable, do not touch me.
Right.
Conversely, an unveiled woman was signaling, I do not belong to a specific man, I am outside the protection of the patriarchal family, I am available for public use, or I am a slave.
It functions almost like a barcode. It tells society exactly who you belong to or if you belong to anyone at all.
And the state enforced this barcode with horrific violence.
Oh, what happened?
Well, if a harlot or a slave dared to veil herself in public, basically attempting to pass as a respectable woman, the punishments laid out in the law were brutal. She could be beaten 50 times with staves, have hot pitch poured over her head, or have her ears cut off.
That level of state violence just for wearing a piece of fabric. I mean, why such extreme panic over a slave wearing a veil?
Because if a harlot wore a veil, she was actively blurring the lines of class and sexual ownership. She was disrupting the visual language of property. The archaic state relied entirely on the clear, unambiguous division of women to function.
Right. If you can't tell who is who.
Exactly. If men couldn't tell the difference between a respectable wife whose offspring would inherit wealth and a not respectable woman whose offspring had no standing, the entire system of inheritance and class security would just collapse. The virginity of daughters and the monogamous faithfulness of wives were no longer just private family concerns. They had literally become essential pillars of national security.
Okay, I am going to push back here for a second because looking at the sources, it seems like we might be painting with too broad a brush.
Fair enough. Go ahead.
Lerner herself mentions that in some periods, specifically in Babylon, there were upper-class women who actually held considerable civic and economic rights.
We are talking about the naughty two women, right? Priestesses who engaged in business, who bought and sold land, who managed massive estates.
Yes, the naughty two women.
Doesn't that historical reality contradict the idea of absolute crushing male dominance? I mean, if a woman holds the purse strings and manages property, surely she has genuine power.
That is a highly observant pushback, and it points to a nuanced complexity that Lerner addresses through the concept of paternalistic dominance.
Oh.
It is historically accurate that certain elite women held significant economic and even administrative power. But we must interrogate the source and the condition of that power. These women were not operating as independent actors. They were exercising what Lerner calls stand-in power.
Stand-in power, like an understudy taking the stage for the lead actor. Precisely the right framework. They received these economic rights and privileges only because of their attachment to elite men. They were the daughters of kings, or they were dedicated as wives to high male gods by their powerful fathers.
Right.
And their grip on this power was entirely contingent on their sexual purity and fidelity. A Natatu priestess, for instance, often had to remain celibate, dedicating her reproductive potential entirely to the deity.
Oh, I see.
Or take a wealthy aristocratic wife. She could manage a vast agricultural estate while her husband was away at war or at court. But if that exact same wife was even suspected of adultery, she could be legally executed by her husband.
So the leash was incredibly long, allowing them to roam the marketplace and the courts, but it was still a leash firmly held by a patriarch.
Yes. They were still dependents. They were engaged in an implicit exchange, absolute sexual submission and behavioral compliance in return for economic protection, physical safety, and class privilege. Their power did not belong to them inherently as women. It was basically leased to them by the men they represented, and that lease could be revoked with lethal force at any moment.
It's the illusion of equality. You are allowed to run the business, and you might even be very good at it, but you are never allowed to forget who actually owns the building.
That's exactly it.
Well, we have explored how physical laws, state violence, and brutal economic realities were used to control bodies and dictate social classes. But history shows us that physical force and legal codes are eventually met with rebellion.
Always.
To control a society for millennia without constant civil war, physical coercion is just insufficient. You have to capture the spiritual imagination of the people. You have to rewrite the cosmos itself.
And this brings us to one of the most profound, slow-moving shifts in human history. To permanently cement this new patriarchal order, the symbolic world, the realm of religion, myth, and philosophy, had to be entirely restructured to reflect, justify, and divine male dominance.
And to our listener, please keep our impartiality disclaimer in mind here. We are analyzing these texts historically, examining how ancient societies utilized myth and philosophy to shape and enforce societal norms over thousands of years.
Absolutely. So let us start with the ancient religions of the Near East. If we look back to the earliest agricultural societies, before the rise of the militarized state, people predominantly worshipped powerful mother goddesses.
Right.
We see figures like the Sumerian goddess Ninhursag or Inanna. These goddesses were venerated because they represented the ultimate awe-inspiring power known to early humanity, the power to create life. They governed human fertility and the agricultural fertility of the earth.
Which makes perfect logical sense for an early society.
Yeah.
If you do not possess a microscopic understanding of the biology of reproduction, the act of women bringing forth new human life from their own bodies looks like pure, inexplicable magic.
It looks like the divine made flesh.
Exactly. It was the central mystery of existence. But as these scattered agricultural communities grew into massive, militaristic imperial kingships ruled by absolute male monarchs, the theology faced a massive crisis of relevance.
It did, because a society ruled by a warlord king whose power rests on conquest and violent subjugation is simply not going to spiritually subordinate itself to a mother goddess who represents nurturing and natural birth.
Right, there's a disconnect.
The spiritual hierarchy must mirror the earthly hierarchy.
Yeah.
So over several centuries, we witness a mythological demotion. Male father gods begin to emerge and slowly replace the goddesses as the supreme deities. First, the powerful goddesses are relegated to being consorts, wives, or sisters to the new male gods.
A demotion.
Yes. And eventually, the very function of creating life, the ultimate divine act, is transferred entirely away from the female deities and given to the male gods.
And Lerner points out that this mythological transition really culminates in the texts of the Judeo-Christian tradition.
Yes, she does. Lerner utilizes the theories of the scholar David Bacon to analyze the profound psychological shifts embedded in the book of Genesis. Bacon argues that a massive cognitive and theological revolution occurred when men fully discovered and understood their own biological role in reproduction.
You mean the discovery that male seed was absolutely necessary for conception?
The discovery of paternity, yes. Once men realized they were biologically essential to the creation of life, they thought to claim the overarching power of procreativity entirely for themselves.
Wow.
We see this psychological claim reflected deeply in the Genesis narrative. Yahweh is presented as a father god, a sole male deity who creates life not through biological birth, but through his word, his breath, his spirit. He is the active creator. And the ultimate absolute symbol of this patriarchal shift is the creation of Eve.
She is created out of Adam's rib.
Exactly. In the older prehistoric myths, the female goddess gave birth to the cosmos and to men. In the new patriarchal myth, man gives birth to woman.
The ultimate role reversal.
The male god holds the ultimate unilateral creative power, and the first human male is the physical source of the female. The natural order of biology is symbolically inverted. Furthermore, in the story of the fall, female behavior is permanently recast.
How so?
Well, when Eve acts autonomously, seeking knowledge outside the bounds of the patriarchal command, her actions are associated with sin, temptation, and the literal downfall of humanity. Her punishment is painful childbirth and subordination to her husband.
It is a complete and total inversion of the old mother goddess narrative. The life giver is transformed into the bringer of death. Let me offer an analogy to clarify the mechanics of this shift because it's wild.
Please do.
It is as if, for millennia, a group of people believed one author wrote the great book of life. Then, men suddenly discover they actually contributed to the manuscript. They realize they are co-authors. But instead of saying, hey, we are co-authors, let's share the credit on the cover, they violently seize control of the publishing house. They fire the female co-authors. They write a brand new introduction claiming they wrote the entire book themselves. And they add a footnote stating that women were merely the printing presses who passively assembled the pages.
That is a brilliantly effective analogy because it captures both the appropriation of the credit and the active diminishment of the female role. And that concept of women as mere printing presses that aligns perfectly with the other foundational pillar of Western civilization, Greek philosophy.
Specifically, the monumental work of Aristotle, right?
Yes, Aristotle, the philosopher who essentially laid the groundwork for Western science, logic, and biology. His influence is impossible to overstate, and his views on gender were devastatingly impactful.
What did he say?
Aristotle didn't just argue that women were socially inferior, which was just the norm of his time. He claimed to prove scientifically that they were biologically defective. He literally defined a female as a mutilated male.
A mutilated male. How on earth did one of the greatest minds in history justify that logically?
He justified it using a philosophical concept central to his work called hylomorphism.
Hylomorphism.
Right, which is the idea that every physical thing is composed of two distinct elements, matter and form. Aristotle argued that in the act of human reproduction, the male and female contributions are not equal. He posited that the male semen provides the soul, the form, the active principle, and the literal blueprint of the child. It provides the motion and the heat.
Okay, and the female?
The female, according to his biology, merely provides the passive receptacle. Her contribution is the inert matter, specifically the menstrual blood, which simply acts as the raw material that the male seed shapes and animates.
So she is literally just the clay, and he is the sculptor.
Exactly. To Aristotle, the male is the active creator, the actor in history, the fully realized human. The female is an incomplete deviation from the male norm. If we synthesize these two massive pillars, the theology of Genesis and the biology of Aristotle, we witness a massive cultural catastrophe for women. These systems permanently severed the concept of creativity from biological procreativity. They established a vast, seemingly impenetrable symbolic construct where men were the norm, the natural leaders, the active intellects, and the spiritual intermediaries.
Right.
And women were inherently defective, spiritually vulnerable, incomplete, and fundamentally marginal.
And we have to remember for the listener that these were not just abstract, esoteric ideas debated by men in togas in coffee shops. These texts became the absolute bedrock of Western law, science, medicine, and theology for the next 2,000 years.
Absolutely foundational.
Which leads me to what is arguably the most uncomfortable, challenging question of this entire deep dive. If the economic laws were violently stacked against them, if the state mandated their subordination, if the dominant religion was rewritten to blame them for the fall of humanity, and if the leading scientific philosophy literally classified them as defective mutants, why did women cooperate?
Right. Why not fight back?
Exactly. Why did this system survive for thousands of years? Why wasn't there a continuous, massive, organized rebellion of half the human race?
That is the crucial question Lerner spends the climax of her book answering. Because patriarchy is not simply a system imposed solely by force. It is a highly sophisticated system that actively requires and successfully secures the ongoing cooperation of the oppressed.
But how does it secure that cooperation when the terms are so, terrible?
Through several interlocking mechanisms. First, we have to return to paternalistic dominance. We have to recognize the unwritten, brutal contract of patriarchy. Women exchange their unpaid domestic labor, their reproductive capacity, their sexual services, and their total behavioral submission in return for economic support and physical protection.
Protection from what, though? Protection from the violence of other men and the very patriarchal system that threatens them.
Precisely the paradox. In a world where women are denied access to weapons, denied access to wealth, and denied legal standing, attaching yourself to a powerful male protector is often the literally only viable strategy for survival.
Because what else are you going to do?
Right. Second, the system ensures cooperation through the artificial division of women. By strictly dividing women into respectable wives who are rewarded with class privileges and deviant, unrespectable women who are violently punished and ostracized, the system effectively prevents women from forming a unified class consciousness.
Is the ultimate divide and conquer strategy.
It is. If your physical survival, your social comfort, and the future of your children depend entirely on proving you are a good woman in opposition to those other women, you will actively police your own behavior, and you will fiercely police the behavior of other women. You become an active participant in the enforcement of the system.
But even with economic coercion and social division, surely over thousands of years, someone points out the man behind the curtain. I mean, why didn't women dismantle the ideology itself?
Because of the ultimate weapon of patriarchal control, the systematic denial of history. For millennia, women were intentionally and systematically kept from interpreting their own past. They were deprived of formal education, excluded from the universities, barred from the priesthood, and silenced in the academies of philosophy and science.
This perfectly brings to mind that famous quote from the existentialist philosopher Simone de Beauvoir. In her seminal book, The Second Sex, she wrote that women are unique among oppressed groups because they have no past, no history, no religion of their own.
Yes. And Lerner's entire project is a profound, paradigm-shifting correction to de Beauvoir's despair.
What does she say?
Lerner argues that de Beauvoir was factually wrong. Women have always had a history. Women have always been central, indispensable actors in making society, driving local economies, inventing technologies, and building civilizations. The great tragedy is not that women didn't make history. It is that they were deliberately, systematically kept from recording it, interpreting it, and integrating it into the cultural consciousness.
The history was happening, but the history books were locked. Lerner uses a theater metaphor to describe this that is incredibly illuminating. Let's expand on it a bit.
Sure.
So imagine human history as this grand, sweeping play that has been running continuously for thousands of years. For almost the entirety of that run, men wrote the script. They directed the actors, they designed the sets, they defined what the play was even about, and they ran the box office. Now, in the last century or so, after immense struggle, women have fought for and won the right to have equal parts on the stage. They are now officially acting in the play.
But the conflict remains.
The conflict remains because the play itself is still fundamentally male. The script the actors are reading from is still based on those Babylonian laws of property. It is still structured by Aristotelian philosophies of active and passive. And it is still colored by narratives of male supreme creation. The only way to achieve true structural equality isn't just to demand more speaking lines in the existing play. Women and men who want liberation from this system have to cluster backstage, look critically at the script, realize the whole premise of the production is rigged, tear it up, and start writing a completely new play.
That is the absolute essence of feminist history. And I want the listener to really reflect on the psychological impact of what it means to grow up without a history. When you are born into a world where all the history textbooks, all the major religious texts, and the foundational philosophies consistently tell you that male dominance is the universal truth, when every cultural artifact suggests that your sex is marginal, secondary, or defective, you unavoidably internalize your own inferiority.
How could you not?
You begin to believe that your subjugation is just natural.
It ceases to be an ideology and just becomes the air you breathe. You don't question gravity and you don't question patriarchy.
But understanding that this system was invented, that we can literally trace its muddy origins to agricultural shifts, demographic pressures, and ancient tax codes, is the skeleton key to undoing that psychological conditioning. If a social system was built by human hands reacting to specific historical pressures, it is not eternal. It can be dismantled by human hands.
Man, what an epic, staggering journey we have taken today. Let's recap the terrain we've covered because it honestly changes everything. We started with the realization that patriarchy is not an inescapable biological destiny. It is a historical invention. We saw how it was born from the Neolithic agricultural revolution, when the demand for labor transformed women's reproductive capacity into a commodified resource to be exchanged for tribal survival.
Right.
We saw how the psychology of domination was solidified by the invention of slavery, where men learned to subjugate captive women before applying those techniques to other men. We traced how this dominance was codified into the brutal laws of archaic states, making the patriarchal family the foundational cell of absolutist governments, visually enforced by laws like the veil. And finally, we explored how this system was permanently cemented into the bedrock of Western culture through the rewriting of religious myths and the biological errors of Greek philosophy, creating an ideology so pervasive it required the denial of women's history to survive.
Exactly.
Patriarchy is not natural, it was built.
And deeply understanding the architecture of how it was built is the very first necessary step toward transcending it.
I want to leave you, our intensely curious listener, with a final, lingering thought to mull over as you go about your day. Think about your daily life. Think about the subtle, almost invisible ways we still judge people's respectability based on their relationships or their sexual history. Think about how we intuitively view leadership, or the subtle gendered language we still use in corporate environments to describe who is active and who is passive. If our core cultural definitions of gender and power were quite literally invented over 4,000 years ago, specifically to support the economic and militaristic needs of ancient Mesopotamian farming empires, how much of your own identity today is genuinely yours?
That's a heavy thought.
And how much of your worldview is just a subconscious echo of a Babylonian law you didn't even know existed until today?
It really forces you to wonder what other aspects of our society we casually accept as natural that are actually just reading from an incredibly ancient, incredibly biased script.
Exactly. Remember the archaeologists at the very beginning of our deep dive. The social landscape of our past might be murky, but once you know what to look for, the ruins of patriarchy are everywhere, hiding in plain sight. Keep digging, keep questioning the natural order of things, and start writing a new script. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.